another adventure where I went up an ass.
From a character that was oppressed to a character that became the oppressor.
Now is the time for action. I'm gonna kill you, Rick.
From a character that was imprisoned in a multiverse to a character that became so free he escaped the multiverse. From someone that you could sympathize with to someone that you have no sympathy for. The character that has adopted the name of the fan base, Evil Morty, to the point that the actual story in the canon calls him Evil Morty 2, might be one of the greatest written villains, asterisk, in the history of animation. Now, I am biased. I'm a huge Rick and Morty fan. I have been for the last freaking decade. But after you go through this journey with me in this very video, you will see Rick and Morty, or at least Evil Morty, through a very, very different light. This character is not a one-note gimmick at using a multiverse to create, oh, Doctor Strange and evil Doctor Strange! But this has used the concept of the multiverse pushed to the absolute extreme at building possibly the greatest character deep dives and created one of the most terrifying villains in fictional history. You are about to hear the deepest ever dive into the philosophy, the story arc, and the potential future of Evil Morty. And you will be a different person by the end of this video. A lot of people complained that Rick and Morty became a very gimmicky show after the first 3 seasons, which was relatively embraced as a completely novel concept, especially with how it tweaked the multiverse and characters and alternate versions of themselves. They didn't do the Marvel shtick.
This is New York and the multiverse.
Where if you have a character in a different dimension, it's just basically the same guy with a different colored shirt. Oh my god, it's flannel shirt Spider-Man, that's crazy!
Yeah.
And Rick and Morty really did a good job at the very beginning tackling the multiversal concepts and falling into a bit of a rut when it comes to talking about the multiverse, because it feels like everything that they could have expressed, they did express in the first 3 seasons, and then following that, the actual multiverse concept.
This guy right here, super weird.
Especially with how oversaturated that overall genre became, felt a little trying. But I would wager, and I would go as far as to say, that the way Rick and Morty tackles character development and character growth and insight into character psychology in a multiverse setting is far better than anything I've seen anywhere else. Little asterisk, Spider-Verse is freaking awesome. But don't you worry, this video is not going to be every other Rick and Morty video on the internet. We're not talking about if it fell off, if it didn't fall off.
Yeah, you fell off.
Justin Roiland drama, new voices, no. We are deep diving into a character, and it's something that I think this entire freaking franchise is sorely missing. First, we have to acknowledge the dynamic between our Rick and Morty, and seemingly the dynamic between pretty much every Rick and Morty. The concept of a multiverse is every possibility exists in a different astral plane. Because of this, the very thing that you are watching take place in the universe that we are following is probably taking place in an alternate universe with a little tiny twist. Oh, in this universe, Rick has boobs. God damn it, we should have totally followed that universe. Holy shit, why are we following? Not the point! Not getting canceled today for talking about GILF hentai, okay?
Because the world is full of idiots.
But the dynamic between Rick and Morty, especially in the early seasons, before the universes that we got to know started branching out more, was, you got Rick, he was this dude, bit of an asshole, huge narcissist, nihilistic bitch face, dragging his grandson around from universe to universe for adventures for whatever reason, and it's incredibly and obviously super traumatizing. Every episode, Morty is at the brink of almost dying, almost collapsing, getting ingested into the anus of some sort of alien centipede, or getting molested by a jelly bean monster in an alternate reality's bathroom. Dude's been having a rough ride.
Just hold your breath until the process is over or your lungs will collapse.
What process?
And honestly, Rick doesn't exactly give him the option to consent on whether he goes on these adventures or not. He's going, and he will obey. Now, obviously, this is the premise of the show, and it's an incredibly volatile relationship, and a downright scary one to look at if anyone's been in a relatively similar relationship being taken advantage of by someone that you should, by all logic, be looking up to. This is your grandpa, he's a genius, he's revered by your mom, he's really talented, you're kind of just a nerdy kid, and this role model in your life is really fucking you up. It's sad, it's dark, and a lot of people would at some point reach their breaking point.
Yeah, pal. Rick and Morty. 100 years.
As we've seen in Season 7, Episode 5 of Rick and Morty, that's exactly what happened with Evil Morty. Evil Morty had that exact same story that our Morty had, except our Evil Morty, he didn't exactly go along with things the way Morty did. He had one bad day. He killed Rick, he controlled Rick, and he began his empire. From this moment forward in the video, I will be discussing this chronologically because as far as character development goes, Evil Morty is awesome because he is our Morty. We understand the psychology of the character we've been following, and we know that one bad day could have turned our Morty into this Evil Morty, where every action that Evil Morty takes further solidifies him as his own individual person. It's the experiences that kept pushing Evil Morty down that path of becoming Evil Morty, and the actions he's taken and the consequences to those actions that further solidified him as the powerhouse, juggernaut character that he ended up becoming. But deep down, the psychology of it all is, our Morty was one bad day away from becoming exactly this. Season 1, Episode 10 probably threw the biggest wrench into the Rick and Morty's canon development that any canon episode has done in a serialized series that I can think of off the top of my head. In this episode, an alternate version of Rick and Morty appear in alternate universes, and all these alternate realities, Rick and Morty are showing up. They are kidnapping the Mortys, they are sometimes killing the Ricks, they are sometimes kidnapping the Ricks. All in all, this is an interdimensional disaster. Now, we've seen alternate universes in the past. Universes where everything is fucking made out of farts and made out of boobs and made out of butts. And now that is really stretching sci-fi to its absolute limits. I love it so much. When we get into the idea that, yes, if it's truly a multiverse and they have accesses to alternate realities, then they will have accesses to alternate realities with Ricks and Mortys. Very basic sci-fi shiz. Immediately, our Rick that we've been following this entire time, who I will be calling Rick Sigma because he is a Sigma male Rick, is immediately the #1 suspect of the Citadel of Ricks, which is a council, basically, of hundreds of thousands of Ricks, who knows how many, from alternate realities that decided they're gonna run away from their own governments just to do their own shtick together, and therefore end up formulate a government of themselves, because I guess they are narcissists and they'll suck their own balls in this crazy economy. Better than some bureaucrat, am I right, gamers? Let's go!
I'm a gamer, and it's gamer time.
Leave a like if you support tax evasion. And when it's eventually found out that our Rick was not the Rick that actually did any of that, our Rick tracks down that Rick and reveals the whole idea that he keeps Morty around is because Morty's idiot brainwaves are canceling out Rick's genius brainwaves, so you literally cannot track him down. Morty is a mobile cloaking device, and the reason why all these Mortys have been captured is because all these Mortys are able to act as this ultimate cloaking device against even Ricks. They track them down, they find the evil lair. At this point in time, they think the Rick is in control of the Morty, and so does the audience, because who would think that Evil Morty is actually a character that exists? We see how incompetent Morty is in comparison to the basically omnipotent Rick.
You're gonna die if you touch me, and there's no afterlife. Everything just goes black. Don't do it.
Eventually, our Rick and Morty have this whole cute character arc, not the point of this video. They end up escaping, they end up winning, that Rick ends up getting killed, they free all the Mortys, including that Rick's Morty, which is the evil Morty that was controlling that Rick the entire time. At the very, very end of that episode, when the Council Citadel of Rick guys are figuring out all this shiz and they find out that that Rick was being controlled remotely, they don't even begin to suspect that one of the Mortys that is being ushered into the Citadel, one of the poor, Rickless Morty bastards that was just saved by the Citadel of Ricks, was actually the one controlling that Rick behind the scenes with an eye patch. Thus begins the saga of Evil Morty. Now, little added bonus, while that Morty's Rick that was being controlled was being killed by all the Mortys over there and being destroyed, he was saying, yeah, kill me, do it, and you later find out that there is some of that Rick that was still alive, and some of that Rick that was left was trying his hardest to find death, and finally was able to find death's cold embrace at that very moment, because that Morty was preventing that Rick from completely dying off so he could basically have a super genius super slave obeying him. Yeah, and thus begins the cycle of oppressed to oppressor. This is a major theme when it comes to Rick and Morty and when it comes to toxic relationships in general, and overall, I think this did a really good job solidifying the mystery that is Evil Morty. I'm sure we'll see him again because of the incredibly spooky scene at the end of the episode with dude's walking away and you're like, oh my god, this music will definitely come back at some point and haunt me in my dreams. And it does. Now, a few very important things to note. That Rick was claiming that his reasoning for kidnapping our Rick was to download the contents of his brain and keep it. And at that point, you were wondering exactly what the scope of this person's strategy is. I mean, if it's truly a Rick doing all this, well, that seems like a pretty Rick thing to do. Just kidnap other Ricks and get all their info because you don't give a crap about anyone except for yourself. You don't even care about other yourselves. It's a very Rick-style mentality. But if Morty is truly the one that's been doing this the whole time, the concept of other Ricks getting their brain contents downloaded is very, very curious. And you start to wonder what Morty's motives are and what Morty's capabilities are. Because this Morty was able to fool a whole bunch of Ricks, but if he truly was able to download the intellect of other Ricks, even if it's not coming from his own personal intellect, this stolen intellect that he may have started possessing might actually be strong enough to overpower other Ricks. We don't know the capabilities of this Morty. We don't know anything. At this time, in the fandom, there were all sorts of theories. Maybe that Morty was actually a Rick that was controlling a Morty, that was controlling a Rick. Maybe it was some Rick went back in time. It was a Rick from the past that went to the future. There were incredible theories about it, and I think that what the actual Rick and Morty story did was so much better than all those freaking theories. Holy crap. Holy crap, bro. MatPat was so wrong on this one, and thank God he was, because we got a brilliant character. So, again, to summarize what we know in the very, very, very briefest of terms, Morty was a character that was abused, that was controlled, and that was overshadowed by his role model character. He went too far and broke that mold. Now, here's the thing. He ended up breaking the mold by becoming sort of the thing he sought to destroy. He's downloading all the intellect of all these other Ricks for some nefarious plot that I will mention very shortly. And by doing so, he is embodying everything that he hated about Rick. He went from being an oppressed guy by Rick to completely oppressing Rick. Someone who hates the concept of how he, Morty, was being stepped on purely to be used as a cloaking device to start using all these other alternate Mortys as a cloaking device. This cycle of going from the abused to the abuser is a very, very dark concept that cannot be understated enough in the actual show. It's not really talked about, not really touched upon, when in actuality it is such a prevalent life cycle of so many tragic cases in the real world. The statistics of child abusers that were abused as children is frightening, and the idea that they're actually tackling some vicious cycle from abused to abuser like this is really, really real. And it's not some wild character that just, that character's psyche was different than someone else's that put them in this position, because that character has the same psyche as the Morty that we are following the entire time. It just goes to show that one tiny bad day, one tiny little action that someone can make differently will send their entire life down an entirely different trajectory. And it's fascinating, as well as terrifying. The next time we see Evil Morty is Season 3, Episode 7, on the next phase of his incredibly nefarious plan that you are not exactly sure if he meant it to go this way or if he's kind of just ad-libbing it as he goes around, even though it is heavily implied in the very newest episode of Season 7, Episode 5, that this was totally ad-libbed. He did not expect his whole plan with the Rick downloading Mind Morty Shield thing to fail, and now that he was in this predicament of a Citadel and seeing that there is elections coming up because of how badly Rick royally fucked the Citadel in the beginning of Season 3, now suddenly he's recognizing a power vacuum and he moves on to the next phase of his plan that he totally makes up right now on the fly. I like this personally. I like that y'all have a villain that could adapt to the situations. Unlike Rick Prime, who is getting a totally other segment situation going on, don't worry, I will be covering him drastically, because goddammit, someone has to, below the surface level. Unlike Rick Prime, that everything perfectly fell into his master plan for eternity, just because he's like this ultimate Rick. For Morty, I really like the idea that, yes, things don't exactly go as planned, and he's going to pick up the pieces that are around him and create something even better out of it. And we very clearly see that the entire massive plot of Season 3, Episode 7 is definitely that exact scenario. Because of the aforementioned power vacuum in the Citadel of Ricks after Season 3, Episode 1, where Rick, our Rick, Sigma Rick, yeah baby, pull bitches Rick, blew the shit up out of it. It was horrible, and they needed to elect a new person through a democracy. Cringe. As everyone knows, I believe in a Nuxtatorship, and I personally would not have made it a democracy, because as a Nuxtator myself, and a hardcore Nuxpublican, I would have had a totally different governing process. But they decided to be cringe and believe in a democracy where people vote on things? Oh god. And because Evil Morty has basically spent the entire life cycle of his, ever since he messed with his original Rick, deconstructing Ricks and finding out how they think, it was all too easy for him to apply pressure in different areas and actually win the election. The thing that makes Rick himself such a deeply fascinating character is not the fact that he is the nihilistic bastard with near omnipotent strength and godlike intellect. It's not him being overpowered that makes him fascinating. It's not the incredibly, albeit satisfying takedowns of egotistical villains that makes him interesting. His fascinating aspects stem from his very human nature behind it all. Despite being the smartest man alive and the biggest atheist in the world, sometimes you'll see him almost dying and start praying to God.
Please, God in heaven, please, God, oh Lord, hear my prayers.
Like in Season 2, Episode 1. Despite completely disagreeing with his whole philosophy of loving people or being attached to things, he clearly very much does. We find out much later in the series that his entire goal, living in the universe with the Rick and Morty and Summer and Beth dynamic that's going on, those are not his original kids/grandkids, because his originals were wiped out by Rick Prime, and he slipped in there to try to, you know, freaking find him, but also managed to develop some sort of actual human attachment to them. At the very beginning of the show, Rick hasn't been around much and just finally moved back home because Rick, for that entire time of Morty's childhood, has been chasing Rick Prime, only to find that our current Morty is in the dimension that Rick Prime originated in. So he slipped in there to try to use that as some sort of way to track down Rick Prime. At this point, he didn't necessarily have an emotional attachment to Morty, but as this series actually continued, he managed to gain one. We see so many times that he's willing to sacrifice himself to save his grandson, like as I've mentioned, Season 2, Episode 1.
I'm okay with this. Be good, Morty. Be better than me.
Very human side of Rick that makes him an interesting character, but it's the very egotistical, scientific side of Rick that is constantly trying to crush down his human side. The reason why I go into this long-winded explanation of what makes Rick an interesting character, and Rick will be getting his own segment/video, don't you worry. I'm doing a deep dive on Rick soon too, because goddammit, someone has to. Everyone just makes Rick and Morty videos talking about freaking drama? Drama? Who cares about drama? Not gonna lie, drama's fucking fun sometimes. I'm not gonna lie. Subscribe to me for drama. I get canceled on Twitter weekly. But anyway, the whole long-winded thing that I just said with the beautiful voice crack at the end that is now in the final video, and I will not be editing it out because I am real and raw, was to point out to you that Rick is a very, very human and emotional human being, despite the fact that he crushes it down. He crushes it down so much even he doesn't believe it for the most part. In the episode where he removes all the toxins from his body, he considers his emotional attachments a toxin and doesn't define himself as someone with these emotional attachments. He is so in his own head about not being emotional and purely being a borderline cyborg, a man of pure analytic intellect, he neglects the side that makes him human. So he is so easy to be manipulated by a Morty that truly understands him. As we dive into the Citadel of Ricks episode in Season 3, Episode 7, no Rick is willing to admit faults in themselves. No one is actually willing to admit flaws in themselves, even though every single one of them just desperately wants to hear them. All the other contenders to become the actual new president of the Citadel of Ricks is not taking it seriously at all, because taking it seriously acknowledges flaws in themselves. Fear of a future acknowledges that they fear a future and that they are not perfect. And Morty is perfectly able to capitalize on the human side of Rick that every other Rick is not willing to admit that they even have. He manipulates them so perfectly, only as a victim of intense trauma by them, and only as someone that has downloaded the schematics of their brains before this. This is someone with the most intimate knowledge of Rick's mind, both from their own perspective and from the perspective of an outsider. He uses the fact that he has been abused by Ricks to understand why Ricks feel the need to abuse. He uses the Rick's fear of not being in control of anything because nothing matters to exact his perfect control. He's always able to have a perfect cop-out answer of any question by saying, listen, I'm just a Morty, and you're a Rick, and you deserve that status, beautifully playing upon their hubris. Every Rick wants their grandkid to love them, despite constantly flaunting in their face that they're just a tool to be used and someone to be replaced. Mortys in general are not nearly smart or capable enough, or as well versed in the insides of Rick's brain to manipulate them, which is why the relationship between a Rick and a Morty is always the abuser and the abused. Now, this changes over time, like we saw in that very same episode with Cop Morty and Cop Rick, where Cop Morty was the manipulator, because he was a little more well versed in the art of what it is to be a Rick. Someone like Evil Morty, someone who saw it from the perspective of the victim and of the perpetrator, that is someone who can truly hit the notes of the rebellion and take over the Citadel. He went from the character that was being dragged around his entire childhood life by Rick, someone who had absolutely no control over his actions, to the one in control. This is growing a villain. This is growing in a villain from an emotional core, with a psychological core, with perfect explanations as to how he was able to perpetrate exactly what he did. This is overpowered, done right. Now, the beauty of the ending of this episode, once again playing that same song. Everyone that questions him ejected from the Citadel. This is a callous Morty. This isn't the Morty that we knew until this point. But there is something very interesting that is 100% worth noting before talking about the next time we bump into Evil Morty. As this show has been progressing, our Morty in our Sigma world has been developing rather quickly. He'll go from being a total bitch that's just listening to everything he's commanded to do in the first season to someone that actually calls the shots at every once in a while as the series progresses. Someone that'll walk out on Rick when he feels like walking out on Rick, and someone that doesn't feel obligated to obey every single one of Rick's commands. That, and every single time that it actually happens, it merely emboldens him to keep going and push the envelope a little further next time. When he becomes one of the Knights of the Sun, he blatantly disregards and disrespects Rick's advice, and he ends up suffering for it. But that said, he does something that he would have never done 3 seasons prior because he was way too much of a little bitch to actually stand up for himself or do what he wants. If you look at Morty in a nutshell, and the mind of Morty, if you take the actions he takes aside, he is a character that is growing up, and he is a character that is grasping towards his freedom. Now, the actions he takes aren't exactly as drastic as Evil Morty's actions, which is why he's not radicalized nearly as much, but he is heading down that same path, albeit in a much gentler fashion. It's only the very, very slight aspects that are in his control and out of his control that made him a different person. But the fact that Evil Morty's mindset is where it is makes such perfect sense from the layout and blueprints of the character Morty that we have been following over the course of 7 seasons. And that is the perfect way to build the psychology of an antagonist. But is he an antagonist, though? Now, I'm going to pose a very interesting question for you before talking about the next 2 major Evil Morty plot episodes. Is Evil Morty an antagonist or not? Now, if you would have asked me this probably a few weeks ago, I would have said, yeah, he's an antagonist, I guess. He goes against the Rick way of life. He's a pretty antagonistic fellow. He's killed lots of people, which would make him a villain. I mean, then again, Rick killed lots of people. I would have probably scratched my little neck beard that I don't have at all because I'm not a weeb. Nailed that landing. But if you look at like a definition of antagonist, it's something that goes against the protagonist, the story that we're following. Just like Rick isn't an antagonist, I would go as far as to say that Evil Morty right now isn't exactly an antagonist either. Everything he's done was, yeah, somehow crossing paths with our Rick every once in a while, but it was relatively in its own story. He didn't actually have some singular individual vendetta against our Rick. And once I realized that, it really made his character a lot more interesting to me. See, unlike our Rick that was wronged by an individual Rick and set his entire life up to destroy Rick Prime, who absolutely is an antagonist, Evil Morty has a very, very different path. You see, Evil Morty went from someone that had no control to someone who wanted control. Evil Morty is someone that's always strived for freedom and never strived for revenge. This is made incredibly clear at the very end of Season 7, Episode 5, where our Morty asks Evil Morty why he doesn't use the Omega Machine weapon shit to wipe out all Ricks from all universes. And he says, well, that's because, you know, all this army of angry Summers are gonna start coming after me. He doesn't have this bloodlust for Rick. Yes, he doesn't like him, nor does he respect him, but it's really not that personal. He wants to escape the fold much more than he wants to tear it down. And that's the major difference between Morty and Rick as characters. And you see this throughout the story. When Rick gets captured by the government at the end of Season 2 and the beginning of Season 3, all Morty wants is Rick to be free from prison. Rick, on the other hand, wants to blow up the entire government. Incredibly based. Unfathomably based. Let's freaking go, Rick. But it's this difference in responses that really solidifies these two as completely separate characters. When something bothers Rick, Rick wants it dead. When something bothers Morty, Morty wants it to stop bothering Morty. And that brings us, ladies and gentlemen, to Season 5, Episode 10. What everyone thought was the final scene with Evil Morty. If you look at the IMDb page review of Season 5, Episode 10, it'll say this is the conclusion of the Evil Morty arc, which it obviously isn't, because they don't know anything about, you know, analytical media consumption, like me. They're not someone that can watch a 20-minute episodes and stretch a reaction into 50 minutes because they're so, because I'm the greatest Nux Locker in the world, goddammit. Yeah, me and my pride and my ego, getting things wrong all the time, but owning up to those mistakes. I didn't actually get anything wrong. I just said that to make it look like I'm a good person. But in Season 5, Episode 10, we're finally revealed the epic master plan of Evil Morty. And that master plan is freedom. He wipes out the Citadel. He basically kills out tons of Ricks to combine their fluid and blood and fucking orgasm juice. I don't know. Listen, the science is a little trippy on this one. To create this epic nut portal gun that uses semen of infinite dead Ricks to create... Okay, listen, again, I'm not a scientist here. But he introduces a really interesting concept to you. This entire story that you are watching until now is about to be thrown on its head. You see, our understanding of the world was Rick is the smartest guy in the multiverse, you know, and it's a multiverse, and you can hop from one universe to the other universe, and then you realize something very, very true and real that you didn't think about. Every multiverse story in the history of multiverse stories, I'm looking at you, Marvel, you piece of shit, sellout son of a bitch, panderball. Every multiverse story is incredibly flawed. To quote Rick Prime from Season 3, Episode 1, before we even knew he was Rick Prime, once you figure out portal travel, you realize that you are the last person to figure out portal travel. A multiverse has an inherent flaw in that, being that there are infinite realities where you are the smartest person in the universe, and there are infinite realities when you are not the smartest person in the universe. That is the definition of a multiverse, where every feasible reality actually exists. And that creates an actual Armageddon. The moment one person figures out portal travel and can breach a multiverse, there are infinite universes where people figured out portal travel to breach the multiverse. The multiverse infinitely collapses in upon itself. No one is special, no one is different, nothing can even exist beside each other anymore. You've reached Cthulhu entity territory, which is just such a great call to the very first opening in Rick and Morty in every season where Cthulhu is chasing them. This is an obvious plot hole in every multiverse story that no one actually tackles or talks about, because then you can't actually have a story. The moment you have one universe's Spider-Man meeting other person universe's Spider-Man, you have infinite universes of infinite Spider-Man meeting each other. Now, I don't think anyone would have actually pointed this out as a flaw when it comes to Rick and Morty, because you literally can't have a story structure in a reality like that. That reality is not something we can comprehend, let alone fit a narrative about. Except it is. You see, Rick wanted to be the smartest person in his reality, or at least this is the motive that was given to him by Evil Morty, so he created something called the Central Finite Curve, which is something that was created in the past, or mentioned at least rather earlier, where he sealed off all the universes where he's the smartest person in the universe with every other universe. This way, he is the only one that could tamper with the multiverse, and in this little pocket of the multiverse that he created, it will not be the Armageddon of multiversal catastrophes that you are seeing outside of the Central Finite Curve. While you are in the Central Finite Curve, there is some part of Rick controlling your life. This is why it seems like a very fitting end to the Evil Morty character arc. His whole goal the entire time was to escape the Central Finite Curve, to get out of a reality that we could fathom, exit into some sort of multiverse that's far beyond any form of sci-fi story, and finally, escape Rick. This is the story of a survivor. Someone who survived abuse and did everything in his power, whether it came to stepping on the innocent or becoming an abuser, to use all the things that he has gained, all the energy and all of the skills and wit that he developed through years of being abused, from being oppressed to become the oppressor, from being the slave to being the only free person. Ha! Bro thinks he's Eren Yeager! And thus concludes the entirety of the Evil Morty saga. At least that's what everybody thought, including IMDb. I'm glad I'm not the only one that thought that there was a possibility. I knew there was a chance he was coming back. Bro, dude, marketing. Evil Morty gets views. He pulls the views. Obviously, you're gonna freaking pull this. It's like having boobs in your freaking TV show. Are you gonna say this is the end of boobs? No, boobs get views. Views equals boobs. That's just basic humanity 101. Of course he's gonna come back. At least that was what I wanted to happen, because this guy's an incredibly interesting character, and I thought he actually had a complete character arc, which is what got me nervous about his coming back, and it blew me away. Man actually went from becoming a perfect antagonistic villain in this story to one of the greatest characters I've ever seen on my screen. You see, he went through the entire Survivor's storyline and character arc. He went through his very own hero's journey, and he completed it, except he didn't. And I will get a little later for my theory as to his role in the future of the Rick and Morty franchise, because I think he will play a massive role, and it will fit perfectly into his narrative, and they are teeing it up so well. But in Season 7, Episode 5, everything changed. We are reintroduced to Evil Morty, except this time from his perspective. We get his backstory. We understand what makes him tick. We see exactly how Morty he is and how he utilized all the stolen Rick mind cells to actually create himself some sort of utopia away from everyone. Out of the Central Finite Curve, a universe that can't exist, constantly collapsing in upon itself, where infinite universes discover portal travel at the same time, constantly swallowing each other up, like the Jetsons reference of the Jetsons family constantly killing each other and portaling over each other's corpses for eternity. This is a catastrophe. This is the Armageddon in a universe where portal travel exists infinitely. And I really hope we delve into this later. I really think this could be an entire massive plot point for maybe the last season of Rick and Morty. Really delving into what a universe without the finite curve is. I really think that in a way Rick did it almost altruistically, not purely narcissistically to make him the smartest person, but literally to create a conceivable reality where his own children could live and not instantly be evaporated by some other universe just superseding it. Perhaps, I don't know. I think that will be revealed at some point, but hey, that's just a theory, a Nux theory. Delving a little deeper into the psyche of Evil Morty, we really start to see what makes him tick and that he is not an antagonist in this tale. I mean, I guess you could call him a villain because he killed tons of people and stuff, so that's pretty villainish. But he's not an antagonist. Rick is still chasing Rick Prime, and he is collapsing universe on top of universe, and Rick clone on top of Rick clone in order to get himself a little bit closer to actually taking down the legitimate Rick Prime, the guy that he had this massive vendetta against, who's also a brilliant character for other reasons that we'll talk about another time. That's really not the character that we're delving into here. And because of all this constant universe collapsing shenanigans, Evil Morty is being affected once again by the geriatric shenanigans of a man that he very much never wanted to hear from ever again. In fact, his entire concept was being free of Rick, and somehow, he's not free of Rick. Rick is still there. He also, over the course of this episode, learns of a super weapon, this Omega Destroyer shenanigan Dragon Ball Z bullshit ability, that he can destroy anyone from every reality. And they prove it on my boy, Slow Mobius. You will be so missed. And once again, this is something that does threaten his existence. If they kill a Morty with this Omega weapon, then every Morty, including him, will be wiped out. To protect literally himself, he has no choice but to once again work with and against Rick. He is being pulled right back into the thing that he sought so desperately to escape. In this episode, he recognizes the other side of Rick, the more human side of Rick. You see, the reason why he hated Rick and why he had his entire rebellion was because Rick was some uncouth guy that was abusing him and not looking at him like he was a person. Someone that merely saw him as a tool, merely as a cloaking device, and merely as a source of laughs every time he gets shoved into some alien's prolapsing butthole. But on this adventure with our Rick, to try to track down Rick Prime and his Omega weapon, he is starting to see a very different side of Rick. A Rick fueled by emotion, the emotion of revenge against a dead wife that he loved, and the emotion of actually a grandson and a relationship with a grandson that he loves. He doesn't take Morty with him to face Rick Prime in case the plan goes awry and that Morty ends up dying. He actually does love him. Preconceived notions that Evil Morty had in his mind about how evil, warped, and twisted Rick is, and wanting a world completely free of Rick, using those weaknesses, those emotional weak points of Rick against him, also kind of blinded him from seeing Rick as a person too, a person that hurts, a person that is also a victim. You see, the major character arc of Evil Morty's story, if I could put it in a single sentence, is someone who went from oppressed to oppressor, or someone who went from a slave to someone free. And he finally recognized the fact that Rick has the same story arc. Someone who was gonna forget all about portal travel and just live a life with his family, but it got a wrench thrown into it because Rick Prime blew it all up. He was oppressed, and his dream was stolen. So he lived a life, building everything up, manipulating his family, joining alternate universes to become the oppressor. They have the same story arc. There's a really funny line that Morty says in Season 7, Episode 5, "The worst shit is a pizza." And when I heard that line, I had no idea what he was talking about. I just figured it was kind of just goofy writing, but in actuality, if you think about it, the worst version of being terrible is just being good. And that could be what this Rick actually is deeper inside. You see, by Evil Morty creating some sort of utopia for him outside of the central finite curve, completely segregating himself off from Rick's, he is putting himself in a very different prison. A prison where he can't have a potentially positive relationship with his grandfather. It's almost a God paradox. Could God create an unmovable boulder that he can't move? Well, if he can create that boulder, then if he can't move it, he's not omnipotent. But if he can move it, then he couldn't create that boulder. Morty wanted freedom so badly, when Evil Morty did all of this shenanigans to escape the central finite curve, he just created another really big prison for himself. A prison where his heart is locked off from a meaningful relationship with a Rick. He found slavery in freedom. What this episode really taught Evil Morty is that freedom is so much more than segregation. There needs to be a level of acceptance in freedom that can truly get you to go forward. You see, freedom is a thing in the heart more than it's a thing in the mind. And his character arc for this entire story, going from the oppressed to going to an oppressor, to constantly trying to live a life of freedom instead of a life of slavery, has only put him in a much bigger cage, but a cage nonetheless. Evil Morty is a fantastically, brilliantly written character, and seeing the character Morty from so many perspectives, had things gone a little differently, is really getting you to open up onto how fascinating every single human's mind truly is. Everyone's gone through trauma. Everyone's gone through heartbreak. Everyone wants to overcome it, and some people go too far and become the villain of someone else's victim story. I don't want to say that the lesson is there's no happy ending, but if you look at the very end of this episode with Rick fighting against Rick Prime and finally killing him, only to realizing that his life is now meaningless, you see something so real about revenge. Revenge is cathartic while it's being enacted, but the moment that is done, you are so empty. He thought that killing Rick Prime would make him free when it put him in a much bigger cage. He has no reason to wake up tomorrow. I think Evil Morty is following a very same trajectory just simply because of how well intertwined they mixed the story and themes of Rick Prime with Evil Morty, two characters who, I'll be completely honest with you, I never thought would actually meet up. See, the beauty of Rick Prime is that he is an antagonist, and the beauty of Evil Morty is that he is not. You see, Evil Morty is not the evil version of Morty, or the worst version that Morty could possibly be. Evil Morty is a Morty that escaped from the cycle of being a Morty, only to find himself in a much bigger cycle of being a Morty. And it's this incredibly well-written character climax of this dude that very much makes me expect him to come back later, to come back and ally up with Rick, where two completely broken people could maybe find solace in the wholesomeness of each other. Because ultimately and fundamentally, that is what every relationship is about, and that is the cornerstone of the story, Rick and Morty. Whew. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed. That was a very deep dive, analytical take on stuff, and I will do more of them if I want to, which I do, so I probably will. Leave a like, subscribe. Video on Rick Prime happening as well. Share this with your fellow nerd friends that aren't just sucked into Justin Roiland drama or that Rick and Morty fell off. And remember to stay weird, fam.